Well, a question has come through on our Romans Q&A. The question is in two parts. It goes this way. How do God's justice and mercy relate to one another in Romans chapter 3? More particularly, if justice strictly demands payment of what is owed, and if mercy is the absence of justice, how can both be true of God's action in Christ? Let's see if we can give these questions a go. Firstly, I want to suggest that mercy isn't really quite just the absence of justice. Mercy is God's compassionate disposition towards those in desperate need. In this case, Romans chapter 3, our desperate need has to do, of course, with our sin and its deserved judgment. Secondly, our passage, Romans chapter 3, doesn't directly speak about mercy, although mercy certainly comes up in Paul's discussions later on in Romans with respect to election, but that's for another term. What Romans 3 does speak about is both God's forbearance and his grace. Now, let's reflect a little bit together on how God's forbearance and grace relate to God's justice and his righteous judgment. Verse 25 of Romans 3 speaks about God's forbearance. That is, his ongoing decision and repeated decision in the past to not act in judgment on human sin as it really did deserve. God delayed enacting his justice, that is, in passing judgment upon human sin as it deserved. That, of course, might appear to pit God's forbearance, his merciful disposition towards us, and his justice against one another, as if there's some split in God. That's not at all the case. But I think it's that kind of tension, apparent tension, that our question was asking about. Well, in the past, God had left unpunished our own human sin. He now presents Jesus as a sacrifice of atonement, an act in which God doesn't simply wipe away our sin as some arbitrary act, but in which Jesus himself chooses to bear God's judgment upon our sin in himself. This is what Paul means in verse 24, where he speaks about us having been justified by grace, by a kindness that is the opposite of what we deserve. And how do we come to receive this undeserved kindness, this grace? Well, it's not simply by God continuing to forbear and overlook our sin, and neither is God's grace simply a matter of him denying or ignoring his righteous and just character. God's grace consists in his actually dealing with our sin in and through Jesus' atoning death, a death in which Jesus himself chooses to bear God's judgment upon our sin in and of himself. And how do we receive this grace, this kindness that is far beyond anything we deserve? Well, we receive it by faith from first to last, as Romans chapter 1 says, by trusting that Jesus' atoning death really has dealt with both our sin and its deserved judgment. Of course, all this is far too wonderful just to neatly wrap up within the space of 3.5 minutes or so. If you head over to our resource page and click on this link that you see circled there on the graphic on your screen, I can think of no better resource to help you understand God's righteousness, our justification, how that fits with Jesus' sacrifice of atonement, than this series of blog posts that this link will take you to. They are short, brief, very, very clear, and they would be my go-to resource if you wanted to understand how all these big ideas and concepts fit clearly and concisely together.